the autumn of 1871, when Massachusetts authorities finally broke down the doors of the abandoned Divine Healing Sanctuary in Salem's outskirts, they discovered something that would haunt investigators for decades to come. Hidden beneath the chapel's floorboards lay 847 detailed medical journals, each documenting what appeared to be impossible cures: paralyzed patients walking, blind individuals seeing, tumors vanishing overnight. But these weren't records of miracles. They were the meticulous documentation of the most elaborate medical fraud in American history, orchestrated by three brothers who had turned divine healing into an art of calculated murder. For 37 years, the Hawthorne family had operated what thousands believed to be God's own healing sanctuary, when in reality, it was a sophisticated laboratory of human experimentation that claimed over 400 lives. The state of Massachusetts sealed these records for 50 years, and church authorities have never publicly acknowledged their existence. Tonight we're going to reveal the terrifying truth about what really happened behind the sacred walls of the Divine Healing Sanctuary. Before we continue with the history of the Hawthorne Brothers and their unholy sanctuary, I need to ask you something. This channel isn't for everyone. Only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest secrets hidden in our history. If you're one of those rare individuals who can handle the truth, no matter how disturbing, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Also, I'm curious, from which state are you listening to this story? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're from. Your courage to seek these buried truths sets you apart from the crowd. Now, let's step back into the shadows of 1834 Massachusetts, where our tale of deception and death truly begins. The year was 1834, and Salem, Massachusetts still carried the weight of its infamous past. 42 years had passed since the witch trials, but the town remained deeply divided between old Puritan families and newer Protestant denominations seeking to establish their spiritual authority. The Second Great Awakening had swept through New England like wildfire, bringing with it a fervent belief in divine intervention and miraculous healing that challenged traditional Calvinist doctrine. Into this atmosphere of religious tension and spiritual hunger arrived three brothers who would forever change the meaning of sacred healing in America. Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne, 38 years old, had studied medicine at Harvard before spending 5 years in Europe, where he'd observed the growing trend of medical tourism and faith healing. His younger brother, Reverend Obadiah Hawthorne, 35, possessed a commanding presence and a voice that could move congregations to tears with its passionate sermons about God's healing power. The youngest, Ezekiel Hawthorne, 32, had trained as an apothecary in Boston and possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of herbs, minerals, and chemical compounds that few in New England could match. The brothers purchased a sprawling colonial estate on the outskirts of Salem, a property that had been abandoned since 1692, when its previous owners fled during the witch trials. The three-story wooden structure sat on 12 acres of land, surrounded by dense pine forests that provided perfect isolation from prying eyes. They immediately began renovations, transforming the main house into what they called the Divine Healing Sanctuary, complete with a chapel, patient rooms, and what they told visitors was a prayer meditation chamber in the basement. What the brothers didn't advertise was the sophisticated laboratory they constructed beneath the chapel, accessible only through a hidden entrance behind the altar. Here, Ezekiel established what would become the most advanced chemical operation in Massachusetts, complete with glass distillation equipment imported from Germany, hundreds of ceramic vessels containing powders and liquids, and detailed anatomical charts that mapped the human nervous system with frightening precision. The Hawthorne brothers understood something that other faith healers of their era missed entirely: the power of specificity. While traveling preachers claimed general healing powers, the Hawthornes specialized in what they called miraculous cures for the incurable. They targeted 3 specific conditions that medical science of the 1830s couldn't treat: sudden onset paralysis, mysterious blindness, and rapidly growing tumors. Each condition, they claimed, could be reversed through intensive prayer and divine intervention, but only at their sanctuary, and only for those with sufficient faith and financial means. The brothers crafted their reputation methodically. Cornelius used his medical credentials to establish relationships with physicians throughout New England, positioning himself as a doctor who wasn't afraid to acknowledge the limits of science when faced with God's greater power. Obadiah traveled to churches across Massachusetts, delivering sermons about the intersection of faith and healing that left congregations spellbound. Ezekiel, meanwhile, worked quietly in the shadows, developing what he called his divine compounds, substances that could create the very conditions his brothers claimed to cure. By the spring of 1835, the Divine Healing Sanctuary had welcomed its first patients, and word of the Hawthorne Brothers' extraordinary abilities began to spread throughout New England. What none of their patients realized was that they were entering the most sophisticated medical fraud in American history, one that would prey on human desperation and faith for over 3 decades. The brothers had learned a crucial lesson from observing other fraudulent healers: the importance of documentation. Every patient who entered their sanctuary was photographed before and after treatment, their conditions meticulously recorded in leather-bound journals that Cornelius maintained with scientific precision. These records, they claimed, were proof of God's work through their ministry. In reality, they were the detailed documentation of a criminal enterprise that would eventually claim hundreds of lives. The Hawthorne Brothers' operation began with what they called divine selection. Cornelius would travel to medical conferences and physicians' offices throughout New England, carefully studying patient records and identifying individuals whose conditions were deteriorating beyond medical help. He maintained detailed correspondence with doctors, positioning himself as a colleague interested in desperate cases where only divine intervention remained possible. But the brothers' true genius lay in their parallel operation: the systematic creation of patients who appeared to need miraculous healing. Ezekiel had spent years developing what he called his reversible affliction compounds, chemical preparations that could induce specific symptoms that perfectly mimicked serious medical conditions. His masterpiece was a powder derived from a rare South American plant that, when administered in precise doses, could cause temporary paralysis that lasted anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months, depending on the concentration. The brothers' method was diabolically simple. They would identify healthy individuals from wealthy families, often targeting those traveling alone or visiting Salem for business. Through carefully orchestrated chance encounters, they would invite these individuals to tour their sanctuary, where Ezekiel would serve them tea laced with his compounds. Within days, the victims would begin experiencing symptoms: gradual loss of feeling in their limbs, mysterious vision problems, or the appearance of what seemed like rapidly growing tumors, actually wax formations injected under the skin while the victims were unconscious. When these manufactured patients began showing symptoms, the brothers would discover their conditions during routine conversations, expressing deep concern and offering the services of their sanctuary. The victims, terrified by their sudden afflictions and desperate for help, would readily agree to treatment. The brothers would then document their conditions extensively, creating before and after photographs that would serve as proof of their miraculous healing abilities. The healing process was theatrical and convincing. Obadiah would conduct elaborate prayer sessions, often lasting several hours, while Cornelius administered what he called divine medicine, actually the antidotes that Ezekiel had developed for each of his compounds. The paralysis would fade, vision would return, and the wax tumors would be skillfully removed during nighttime divine surgery performed while patients were sedated. The brothers charged enormous fees for their services, typically demanding between $500 and $2,000 per patient, fortunes that represented lifetime savings for most families. They justified these costs by claiming that true divine healing required substantial sacrifice and that their ministry needed funding to continue God's work. Most families gladly paid, believing they were witnessing genuine miracles. Word of the Hawthorne Brothers' success spread throughout New England and beyond. By 1837, they were receiving letters from families across America, begging for their help with genuinely ill relatives. The brothers found themselves in a predicament. They had built their reputation on a 100% success rate, but now they were being asked to treat patients with real incurable conditions. Their solution was as cold-blooded as it was logical. When patients arrived with genuine medical conditions, actual paralysis from strokes, real tumors, or hereditary blindness, the brothers would conduct their usual elaborate ceremonies. But instead of administering healing compounds, Ezekiel would prepare what he called divine transition medicine, carefully calculated doses of morphine and other substances that would cause patients to die peacefully in their sleep. The brothers would then explain to grieving families that their loved ones had been called home by God just as the healing was about to take place. They would offer elaborate theological explanations about divine timing and the mysteries of God's plan while privately documenting these deaths in separate journals they kept locked away in their basement laboratory. This dual operation, manufacturing miracles for healthy patients while quietly eliminating genuinely sick ones, allowed the brothers to maintain their reputation for supernatural healing while generating enormous profits. They understood that in an age where medical knowledge was limited and faith was strong, families would rather believe in a divine mystery than question what seemed like miraculous healing. Margaret Whitmore arrived at the Divine Healing Sanctuary on a gray October morning in 1839, carrying with her a letter of introduction from a physician in Boston and a heart heavy with desperation. Her 22-year-old daughter Sarah had begun experiencing strange symptoms 3 weeks earlier: sudden dizzy spells, gradual loss of vision in her left eye, and a growing weakness in her hands that made simple tasks impossible. Margaret had spent her late husband's entire legacy seeking treatment for Sarah in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, but no physician could explain her daughter's condition. When Dr. Cornelius Hawthorne contacted her through their family physician, claiming he had successfully treated identical cases through divine intervention, Margaret saw it as an answer to her prayers. The Hawthorne brothers welcomed Margaret and Sarah with the warmth and authority that had made their reputation. Cornelius examined Sarah with practiced professionalism, asking detailed questions about her symptoms while taking careful notes. Obadiah prayed over the young woman with passionate intensity, declaring that he could sense divine healing energy surrounding her case. Ezekiel, meanwhile, prepared what he called preparatory medicine to help Sarah's body ready itself for healing. What Margaret didn't know was that Sarah's symptoms perfectly matched the effects of one of Ezekiel's compounds, a substance he had administered to her during a carefully orchestrated meeting at a Boston coffee house 2 months earlier. Sarah was not genuinely ill. She was one of the brothers' manufactured patients, selected because her family's wealth made them ideal targets for their expensive healing services. Margaret agreed to pay the brothers' fee of $1,200 and arranged for Sarah to stay at the sanctuary for intensive treatment. For the next 3 weeks, she watched her daughter undergo elaborate healing ceremonies, consume specially prepared medicines, and participate in extended prayer sessions that seemed to gradually restore her health. Sarah's vision began returning, her strength improved, and the dizzy spells became less frequent. On November 15, 1839, Sarah experienced what appeared to be a complete recovery. Her vision was fully restored, her hands were steady, and she felt stronger than she had in months. Margaret wept with joy, praising God for the miracle she had witnessed. The brothers photographed Sarah before and after her treatment, adding her case to their growing collection of documented healings. But Margaret's gratitude turned to suspicion when she discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. While packing Sarah's belongings for their departure, she accidentally knocked over a small wooden box in Sarah's room. The box opened, revealing a collection of brown glass vials, each labeled with strange symbols and containing different colored powders and liquids. Margaret had worked as a schoolteacher before her marriage and had always been curious about scientific matters. She carefully copied the symbols from the vials onto a piece of paper, planning to ask a pharmacist about them when she returned to Boston. But when she showed the symbols to Mr. Henley, the apothecary who had supplied medicines to her family for years, his face went pale. "Mrs. Whitmore," he whispered, glancing around his shop to ensure they were alone. "These are not healing compounds. This symbol here indicates belladonna extract, a poison that causes vision problems and weakness. This one is wolf's bane, which creates paralysis. And this," he pointed to a symbol that looked like a twisted tree. "This is something I've never seen before, but the notation suggests it's an antidote compound." Margaret felt the world shift beneath her feet. If the vials contained poisons and antidotes, then Sarah's illness had been artificially created, and her healing had been nothing more than an elaborate performance. Cher turned to Salem that same evening, determined to confront the Hawthorne brothers and demand an explanation. But when she arrived at the sanctuary, she found the brothers prepared for her visit. They welcomed her warmly, expressing concern about her obvious distress. When she produced the paper with the copied symbols, Cornelius examined it with apparent confusion. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "I'm afraid someone has played a cruel joke on you. These symbols are from an old alchemical text. Medieval superstitions that have nothing to do with modern medicine or divine healing. Perhaps someone placed those vials in Sarah's room to test your faith or cause doubt about the miracle you witnessed." Obadiah nodded gravely. Satan often attacks those who have witnessed God's power, Mrs. Whitmore. He seeks to plant seeds of doubt about divine healing through deception and confusion. You must not let these mysterious vials diminish the reality of your daughter's healing. Margaret wanted to believe them, but something in their manner, a subtle tension, a too careful choice of words, made her increasingly suspicious. She decided to investigate further, beginning with other families who claimed to have experienced miracles at the sanctuary. Margaret's investigation led her to the Puritan family of Concord, whose son had supposedly been healed of sudden paralysis 6 months earlier. When she spoke with Mrs. Puritan, she discovered disturbing similarities between their cases. Like Sarah, young Thomas Puritan had developed his symptoms gradually after a chance encounter with a stranger in a public place. Like Sarah, his condition had followed a specific pattern: weakness, then partial paralysis, then gradual recovery during treatment at the sanctuary. But Mrs. Puritan revealed something that made Margaret's blood run cold. During Thomas's treatment, she had noticed that Ezekiel Hawthorne seemed to know exactly which medicines to prepare and when to administer them, as if he were following a predetermined schedule rather than responding to her son's condition. When she had commented on this to Cornelius, he had explained that divine healing often followed God's perfect timing, but she had found his answer unsatisfying. Margaret continued her investigation, tracking down 12 families who had brought patients to the sanctuary over the past 4 years. In every case, she found the same pattern: sudden onset of symptoms following chance encounters with strangers, gradual deterioration, then complete recovery during treatment by the Hawthorne Brothers. The symptoms were always the same: paralysis, vision problems, or mysterious tumors that appeared and disappeared without explanation. But Margaret also discovered something else that filled her with horror. 3 families told her about patients who had died during treatment at the sanctuary, genuinely ill individuals who had come seeking healing for real conditions. In each case, the brothers had explained that the patients had been called home by God just as healing was about to occur. The families had accepted these explanations, finding comfort in the belief that their loved ones had been welcomed into heaven. Margaret realized that the Hawthorne brothers were operating 2 separate schemes simultaneously. They were creating artificial illnesses in healthy patients, then charging enormous fees to cure them while systematically eliminating genuinely ill patients to maintain their reputation for successful healing. The scope of their deception was staggering, and the human cost was becoming clear. She decided to return to the sanctuary one final time, not as a grateful patient's mother, but as an investigator determined to expose the truth. She arrived on a snowy December evening, telling the brothers that she wanted to make a substantial donation to their ministry in gratitude for Sarah's healing. They welcomed her warmly, inviting her to stay for dinner and tour their facilities. During the meal, Margaret carefully steered the conversation toward their healing methods, asking detailed questions about their success rate and the types of conditions they treated. The brothers spoke with confidence about their 100% success rate, explaining that they only accepted patients whom God had chosen for healing. When Margaret asked about patients who had died during treatment, they explained that these individuals had been called home after their healing was complete, but in a spiritual rather than physical sense. After dinner, Obadiah offered to show Margaret their private chapel, where they conducted their most intensive healing ceremonies. As they walked through the sanctuary, Margaret noticed details she had missed during her previous visits. Through unusually thick walls, the sound dampening that seemed designed to prevent noise from traveling between rooms, and the careful placement of furniture that could conceal hidden doors or passages. When they reached the chapel, Margaret excused herself to use the necessary, but instead of leaving the building, she hid behind a large wooden cabinet near the altar. She waited until she heard the brothers retire to their private quarters, then began exploring the chapel more thoroughly. Her persistence was rewarded when she discovered a loose floorboard behind the altar. When she lifted it, she found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Despite her fear, Margaret descended into what she would later describe as the most horrifying sight of my life. A fully equipped laboratory containing hundreds of glass vessels, detailed anatomical charts, and rows of leather-bound journals filled with the brothers' meticulous documentation of their crimes, the basement laboratory beneath the divine healing sanctuary was a testament to the Hawthorne brothers' methodical approach to their criminal enterprise. Margaret found herself in a space that had been carved out of the foundation and expanded to span nearly the entire footprint of the building above. The walls were lined with sturdy wooden shelves that held hundreds of glass containers, each carefully labeled with symbols that corresponded to different compounds and their effects. Along one wall, Margaret discovered Ezekiel's chemical apparatus, a sophisticated arrangement of glass tubes, heated vessels, and distillation equipment that would have been impressive in any university laboratory. Tables were covered with scales, measuring devices, and notebooks filled with precise calculations and chemical formulas. The air carried a strange mixture of odor, sweet floral scents mixed with bitter medicinal smells that made Margaret's eyes water. But it was the documentation that truly revealed the scope of the brothers' operation. Margaret found herself looking at shelves lined with leather-bound journals, each one meticulously organized by year and patient type. The journals were divided into two distinct categories: divine healings and divine transitions. The first category contained detailed records of patients who had been artificially afflicted and then cured, while the second documented those who'd been quietly eliminated. Opening one of the divine healing journals, Margaret found entries that read like scientific case studies. Each patient was assigned a number and their treatment was documented with frightening precision. She read entries like patient 47 administered compound C7 paralysis inducer at 3.2 ratio mixed with chamomile tea. Symptoms appeared within 72 hours as predicted. Subject experienced complete lower body paralysis by day 8. Administered antidote C7 during healing ceremony day 21. Full recovery achieved within 48 hours. Payment received $800. Photograph documentation complete. The divine transition journals were even more disturbing. These entries documented the systematic murder of genuinely ill patients with clinical detachment that made Margaret's hands shake as she read. Patient 23, genuine paralysis from stroke. Administered compound X4 morphine derivative during evening prayer session. Subject expired peacefully at 11:30 p.m. Family informed of divine calling. Payment received $1,500, body prepared for burial with standard preparation compounds to prevent detection. Margaret discovered that the brothers had been perfecting their methods for years, developing increasingly sophisticated compounds that could mimic virtually any medical condition. Ezekiel's notebooks contained detailed research on the human nervous system, circulation, and the effects of various plant and mineral compounds on different organs. He had essentially created a catalog of artificial diseases and their corresponding cures. In one corner of the laboratory, Margaret found what appeared to be a small surgical area complete with a table, instruments, and containers of what looked like medical supplies. She realized this was where the brothers performed their divine surgery to remove the wax tumors they had implanted in patients while they were unconscious. The precision and planning involved in their operation was staggering. Perhaps most disturbing was Margaret's discovery of a detailed ledger that tracked the brothers' financial success. Over 5 years, they had generated over $40,000 in payments from patients, an enormous fortune that represented the combined life savings of dozens of families. The ledger also contained plans for expansion, including correspondence with potential associates in other states who were interested in establishing similar divine healing operations. Margaret spent 3 hours in the laboratory copying as many names and details as possible from the brothers' journals. She found records of patients she had interviewed during her investigation, confirming her suspicions about the artificial nature of their illnesses, but she also found evidence of crimes that went far beyond medical fraud. The brothers had been systematically murdering patients for years, and their success had made them increasingly bold in their methods. As she prepared to leave the laboratory, Margaret heard footsteps above her in the chapel. The brothers had discovered her absence and were searching for her. She quickly replaced the journals and climbed the stairs. But as she reached the top, she found herself face to face with Cornelius Hawthorne, who was holding a lantern and wearing an expression of cold fury. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I'm afraid you've seen things that were not meant for your eyes." The confrontation between Margaret Whitmore and the Hawthorne brothers in the candlelit chapel would later be described in court documents as the moment when years of carefully constructed deception collided with unshakable determination for truth. Cornelius stood blocking the hidden entrance to the laboratory, his medical bag in one hand and a lantern in the other, while Odiah and Ezekiel emerged from the shadows near the altar. "Mrs. Whitmore," Obadiah said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used during healing ceremonies. You have wandered into areas of our sanctuary that are reserved for private prayer and meditation. I'm afraid you may have misunderstood what you've seen. Margaret, still clutching the papers where she had copied information from the brothers' journals, faced the three men with a courage that surprised even herself. I understand perfectly what I've seen, she replied, her voice steady despite her fear. I've seen the records of your crimes, the poisons you've used to create artificial illnesses, the antidotes you've administered as fake cures, and the documentation of the murders you've committed. The brothers exchanged glances, and Margaret saw something shift in their demeanor. The masks of religious authority and medical compassion fell away, revealing the cold calculation that had driven their operation for years. You're speaking of things you couldn't possibly understand, Cornelius said, stepping closer. The work we do here represents the highest form of healing. We give people hope, we strengthen their faith, and we provide them with experiences that transform their lives. The methods we use are irrelevant compared to the spiritual benefits we provide. Spiritual benefits. Margaret's voice rose despite her attempt to remain calm. You've been poisoning healthy people and murdering sick ones. You've stolen fortunes from desperate families and built your reputation on systematic fraud and murder. Ezekiel, who had been silent until now, spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore, you have two choices. You can leave this sanctuary tonight and never speak of what you think you've seen, or you can join the patients who have been called home by God during their healing process. The threat was clear, but Margaret had prepared for this moment. During her investigation, she had written detailed letters to authorities in Boston describing her suspicions and the evidence she had gathered. She had left these letters with her attorney with instructions to deliver them to the Massachusetts Attorney General if she failed to return from Salem by a specific date. I'm afraid it's too late for threats, she told the brothers. I've already documented everything I've discovered about your operation. If something happens to me, authorities will know exactly where to look and what to investigate. The brothers realized they were facing a situation they had never encountered before. A witness who had not only uncovered their methods but had also prepared for the possibility of retaliation. For the first time in their criminal careers, they were dealing with someone who had been methodical in gathering evidence and protecting herself. Cornelius made a decision that would ultimately seal their fate. Rather than attempting to harm Margaret, he chose to make one final attempt at deception. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone, I can see that you're a woman of intelligence and compassion. What if I told you that our work, unconventional as it may seem, has brought comfort to hundreds of families? What if I explained that sometimes the appearance of healing is just as beneficial as actual healing? You're asking me to become complicit in murder, Margaret replied. I've seen your records. I know how many genuinely sick patients you've killed to maintain your reputation. The conversation continued for another hour with the brothers, alternating between threats, bribes, and attempts at justification. They offered Margaret substantial sums of money to remain silent, promised to cease their operation if she would agree to keep their secrets, and even suggested that she could become a partner in their enterprise. But Margaret remained unmoved. Finally, Obadiah made a statement that would later be used as evidence of premeditation in their trial. Mrs. Whitmore, you have forced us into a position where we must choose between our life's work and your silence. We have spent years building something that brings meaning to people's lives, and we cannot allow one person's misguided sense of justice to destroy everything we've accomplished. Margaret recognized this as a final threat, but she also understood that the brothers were now operating in desperation rather than from their usual position of calculated control. She backed toward the chapel door, keeping her eyes on the three men while reaching for the handle. I'm leaving now, she said firmly, and I'm going to ensure that the authorities know exactly what you've been doing here. The families who have lost loved ones deserve to know the truth, and the people you've defrauded deserve justice. She opened the door and stepped into the cold December night. But as she walked away from the sanctuary, she heard Ezekiel call out behind her, Mrs. Whitmore, you have no idea what you've set in motion. Our work here is bigger than you understand, and there are others who will continue what we've started. Margaret didn't look back as she walked through the snow toward Salem, but she carried with her the knowledge that she had uncovered one of the most sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history. What she didn't know was that her investigation would ultimately reveal connections to similar operations in other states, and that the Hawthorne Brothers network extended far beyond their small sanctuary in Massachusetts. Margaret's revelations to the Massachusetts authorities triggered an investigation that would ultimately expose a criminal network spanning multiple states and involving dozens of individuals. When Sheriff Thomas Hartwell and his deputies arrived at the Divine Healing Sanctuary on December 22, 1839, they found the brothers had fled during the night, leaving behind only their extensive documentation and laboratory equipment. The investigation revealed that the Hawthorne brothers had been corresponding with similar operations in Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Their letters, found in a locked chest in Cornelius's room, showed that they had been sharing techniques and compounds with other fraudulent healers, creating a network of coordinated medical fraud that had been operating for nearly a decade. District Attorney William Morrison, who led the prosecution, later described the scope of the investigation as unprecedented in American criminal history. The brothers had maintained correspondence with 17 different individuals who were operating similar schemes, ranging from small-scale operations targeting individual families to large sanctuaries that attracted patients from across the region. The investigation revealed that the network had developed standardized methods for creating artificial illnesses, training procedures for new operators, and even a system for sharing information about wealthy families who might be targeted for their schemes. The brothers had been essentially franchising their operation, providing compounds and techniques to associates in exchange for percentages of their profits. When authorities raided the other locations identified in the brothers' correspondence, they found evidence of similar operations in Hartford, Albany, Philadelphia, and Richmond. The coordinated raids conducted simultaneously on January 15, 1840, resulted in the arrest of 14 individuals and the recovery of extensive documentation that revealed the true scope of the network. The evidence showed that the network had been responsible for the deaths of over 400 genuinely ill patients across 5 states, while defrauding thousands of families out of their life savings. The artificial illness schemes had generated over $200,000 in fraudulent payments, making it one of the most financially successful criminal enterprises in American history at that time. But the investigation also revealed something that horrified even experienced law enforcement officials. The brothers had been conducting what they called compound research using unwilling subjects. Their laboratory contained detailed documentation of experiments performed on patients who had been given increasingly dangerous combinations of chemicals to test their effects on the human body. Sheriff Hartwell's official report described finding evidence of systematic human experimentation that rivals the most disturbing accounts of medical abuse in European history. The brothers had been using their patients as test subjects for developing new compounds, carefully documenting their results of various chemical combinations and their effects on different organs and systems. The manhunt for the Hawthorne brothers extended across multiple states with wanted posters distributed throughout New England and beyond. Federal marshals became involved when evidence suggested the brothers had fled to territories beyond state jurisdiction. The search was complicated by the fact that the brothers had maintained multiple identities and had established safe houses in several locations. Margaret Whitmore became the key witness in the prosecution's case, providing detailed testimony about her discovery of the laboratory and her confrontation with the brothers. Her careful documentation of the evidence she had found proved crucial in establishing the scope of their crimes and the systematic nature of their operation. The trial, when it finally began in September 1840, attracted national attention. Newspapers across the country covered the proceedings, and the courtroom was packed with family members of victims, medical professionals, and religious leaders who wanted to understand how such an elaborate deception had been maintained for so long. The prosecution presented evidence that painted a picture of calculated cruelty and systematic exploitation of human desperation. Witness after witness testified about their experiences with the brothers, describing the artificial illnesses they had suffered and the enormous fees they had paid for fake cures. Families of patients who had died during treatment testified about their losses. Finally, understanding that their loved ones had been murdered rather than called home by God, the defense attempted to argue that the brothers had genuinely believed in their healing abilities and had only documented their methods to better understand divine intervention. But the extensive evidence of premeditation, the systematic nature of their crimes, and the clear financial motivations made this argument impossible to sustain. When the time comes to reveal the final truth about the Hawthorne Brothers network, remember that you're among the select few who have the courage to har these darkest secrets of American history. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You're someone who seeks truth regardless of how disturbing it might be. Hit that like button if this investigation is sending chills down your spine. And don't forget to subscribe for more hidden stories that few channels dare to tell. Share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries, because together, we're uncovering secrets that have been buried for over a century. The trial of the Hawthorne brothers took an unexpected turn when Ezekiel Hawthorne, the youngest brother and the mastermind behind their chemical operation, was captured in Baltimore in November 1840. Unlike his brothers, who had maintained their innocence and claimed to be genuine healers, Ezekiel chose to cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony, delivered over 3 days in a packed courtroom, revealed details about their operation that shocked even the prosecutors who had been investigating the case for nearly a year. Ezekiel explained that their network had been developing what they called medical theater, elaborate performances designed to simulate miraculous healing while generating enormous profits from desperate families. "We understood," Ezekiel testified, "that people needed to believe in miracles more than they needed actual healing. Our artificial illnesses and cures provided them with experiences that strengthened their faith and gave them hope, even if the medical effects were temporary. We saw ourselves as providing a service that doctors and traditional healers couldn't offer." But Ezekiel's testimony also revealed the cold calculation behind their systematic murders. When asked about the patients who had died during treatment, he explained their reasoning with chilling logic. "Genuinely ill patients presented a problem for our reputation. We had built our success on a 100% healing rate, and we couldn't allow real diseases to damage our credibility. The transition medicine we provided ensured that these patients died peacefully, and their families found comfort in believing they had been called home by God." The prosecution then presented evidence that would forever change how the case was understood. Hidden in Ezekiel's Baltimore laboratory, authorities had discovered a series of journals that documented what he called advanced research, experiments conducted on patients without their knowledge or consent. These experiments had been designed to test the effects of various compounds on the human body, with results that would later be used to develop more sophisticated artificial illnesses. The journals revealed that the brothers had been using patients as test subjects for chemical combinations that could create virtually any symptom imaginable. They had developed compounds that could cause temporary blindness, paralysis, skin conditions, respiratory problems, and even mental confusion. Each compound had been tested on multiple patients, with the results carefully documented for future use. But the most disturbing revelation came when Ezekiel described their long-term goals. The brothers had been working toward what they called medical legitimacy. They planned to eventually transition from fraudulent healing to becoming recognized medical researchers. They intended to use their accumulated wealth and documented research to establish a legitimate medical institution where they could continue their human experiments under the guise of scientific advancement. "We-believed," Ezekiel testified, "that our research would eventually contribute to genuine medical breakthroughs. The compounds we developed and the systematic documentation of their effects represented valuable scientific knowledge that would benefit humanity. The methods we used were necessary to advance medical understanding in ways that traditional research could never achieve." The prosecution's final witness was Dr. Henry Patterson, a physician from Harvard Medical School, who had been asked to review the brothers' research documents. His testimony provided the scientific context that helped the jury understand the true nature of their crimes. What the Hawthorne brothers created, Dr. Patterson explained, was not medical research, but systematic human experimentation conducted without consent and designed primarily for financial gain. Their compounds were not treatments, but weapons used to create artificial suffering for profit. Their documentation, while scientifically detailed, represents evidence of calculated cruelty rather than medical advancement. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The brothers were sentenced to death for murder, with the judge declaring that their crimes represented an assault on the very foundations of trust between healers and patients, and a perversion of religious faith that demands the ultimate punishment. But even as justice seemed assured, the full scope of the Hawthorne network continued to unfold. Ezekiel's cooperation led authorities to a hidden warehouse in Boston, where the brothers had stored their accumulated wealth and research materials. The warehouse contained over $60,000 in cash and gold, hundreds of chemical compounds, and what prosecutors described as the most comprehensive collection of human experimentation data in American history. Among the materials was a leather-bound ledger that Ezekiel called his master research journal. This document contained detailed plans for expanding their operation nationwide with specific targets in major cities and correspondence with potential associates as far west as St. Louis and as far south as New Orleans. The brothers had envisioned creating a network of fraudulent healing sanctuaries that would span the entire country. The ledger also revealed that they had been developing what they called advanced compounds, chemical preparations that could create symptoms indistinguishable from serious diseases like consumption, heart conditions, and even certain forms of madness. They had planned to expand beyond their traditional targets of paralysis, blindness, and tumors to encompass virtually every major medical condition known to 19th century medicine. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of what Ezekiel called his elimination protocols, detailed procedures for killing patients in ways that would appear natural and could be attributed to their existing conditions. The brothers had developed methods for inducing heart failure, respiratory collapse, and even strokes that would leave no trace of foul play during the limited autopsies performed in that era. The execution of Cornelius and Obadiah Hawthorne on March 15, 1841, marked the end of their criminal careers, but not the end of their influence on American medical fraud. Ezekiel, whose cooperation had secured him a life sentence rather than execution, continued to provide information to authorities about similar operations across the country for several years after his brothers' deaths. His revelations led to the discovery of fraudulent healing operations in 12 additional states, resulting in over 50 arrests and the recovery of evidence documenting crimes that spanned nearly 2 decades. The Hawthorne Network, as investigators came to call it, had been far more extensive than anyone had initially realized. The investigation revealed that the brothers had been training associates in their methods since 1836, providing detailed instruction manuals and starter supplies of compounds to individuals who wanted to establish their own fraudulent healing operations. These associates had been operating independently while sharing information and techniques with the central network, creating a web of criminal activity that extended from Maine to Georgia. One of the most disturbing discoveries was a series of letters between Ezekiel and a physician in Charleston, South Carolina, discussing the possibility of using their compounds to create artificial slave illnesses that could be cured for propaganda purposes. The letters suggested that some slaveholders had been considering using fraudulent healing demonstrations to support claims about the beneficial effects of slavery on African American health. The medical community's response to the Hawthorne revelations was swift and comprehensive and indignant. Schools began requiring courses on identifying fraudulent treatments, and professional medical associations established committees to investigate suspicious healing claims. The case became a turning point in American medical practice, leading to increased regulation and oversight of alternative healing methods. Religious communities were equally affected by the scandal. Many denominations issued official statements distancing themselves from faith healing practices and establishing guidelines for evaluating claims of miraculous healing. The Hawthorne case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing religious faith with medical treatment, and it influenced theological discussions about the nature of divine intervention for decades. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Hawthorne case was its effect on public trust in medical authority. The revelation that respected physicians could engage in such systematic deception led to increased skepticism about medical claims and greater demand for evidence-based treatment. The case contributed to the development of more rigorous medical testing procedures and ethical guidelines that would eventually evolve into modern medical standards. Margaret Whitmore, whose courage had exposed the entire network, became a prominent advocate for medical reform and patient rights. She used her experience to establish one of America's first patient advocacy organizations, working to educate families about medical fraud and providing support for victims of fraudulent treatment. Her work led to the passage of Massachusetts's first medical fraud prevention laws in 1845, which required healers to provide evidence of their training and prohibited the administration of undisclosed substances to patients. These laws became a model for similar legislation in other states and helped establish the legal framework for modern medical regulation. In 1871, 30 years after the execution of the Hawthorne brothers, authorities received an unexpected letter from the Massachusetts State Prison. Ezekiel Hawthorne, now 69 years old and dying of consumption, requested a final meeting with investigators to reveal what he called the complete truth about their operation. The meeting held in the prison infirmary on a cold February morning would provide the final pieces of a puzzle that had haunted investigators for 3 decades. Ezekiel, his voice weakened by illness, but his mind still sharp, began with an admission that stunned even experienced investigators. "Everything you discovered about our operation," he whispered, "was only the surface of what we accomplished. The artificial illnesses, the murders, the financial fraud, these were simply the visible aspects of a much larger experiment in human behavior and social control." Ezekiel revealed that the brothers had been conducting what they called faith manipulation research, systematic studies of how religious belief could be exploited to control human behavior. Their healing ceremonies had been designed not just to generate profits, but to gather data about the psychological mechanisms that governed faith, hope, and desperation. "We documented everything," Ezekiel explained. "Every patient's reactions, every family's responses, every community's interpretation of our work. We were creating a comprehensive understanding of how human beings respond to the promise of miraculous intervention." Our journals contained far more than medical data. They were detailed psychological profiles of human vulnerability. The implications of this revelation were staggering. The brothers had essentially been conducting one of the first systematic studies of psychological manipulation in American history, using their patients as unwitting subjects in experiments designed to understand the limits of human gullibility and the power of false hope. Ezekiel also revealed that their network had been sharing this psychological data with associates who were using it for purposes beyond medical fraud. Some associates had been politicians interested in understanding how to manipulate public opinion, while others had been businessmen seeking to develop more effective advertising and sales techniques. "We proved," Ezekiel said, his voice barely audible, "that human beings will believe almost anything if it's presented with sufficient authority and wrapped in the promise of miraculous intervention. Our research showed that people's need to believe in the impossible is so strong that they will ignore obvious evidence of deception if maintaining their faith provides emotional comfort." But Ezekiel's final revelation was perhaps the most disturbing of all. In a metal box hidden beneath his cell's floorboards, he had preserved a single journal that contained what he called his ultimate research, detailed plans for using their psychological manipulation techniques on a massive scale. The journal outlined strategies for creating artificial crises that could be resolved through fraudulent interventions, methods for identifying and exploiting community vulnerabilities, and techniques for maintaining long-term deception through careful management of evidence and witnesses. It was, investigators realized, a comprehensive manual for large-scale social manipulation disguised as scientific research. "Our work at the Sanctuary," Ezekiel concluded, "was never really about healing or even about money. It was about proving that human society is built on foundations that can be systematically undermined by those who understand the mechanisms of faith and fear. We demonstrated that even the most sacred trusts between healers and patients, between religious leaders and congregations, can be exploited by individuals with sufficient knowledge and determination." Ezekiel Hawthorne died 3 days after this final confession, taking with him the complete details of psychological manipulation techniques that would not be formally studied by legitimate researchers for another century. His journal was sealed by court order and remained classified until 1971, when it was finally released to academic researchers studying the history of medical fraud. The Divine Healing Sanctuary remained abandoned for over 30 years after the arrest of the Hawthorne brothers. Local residents reported strange sounds and unexplained lights in the building, leading to rumors that the site was haunted by the spirits of the brothers' victims. In reality, these phenomena were likely caused by the chemical residues from Ezekiel's laboratory, which continued to emit vapors and create unusual reactions in the building's materials. In 1872, the building was finally demolished by order of the Salem City Council, but workers discovered something that had been missed during the original investigation. Beneath the laboratory, Ezekiel had constructed an additional chamber that contained his most sensitive research materials. This hidden room held detailed documentation of experiments that made even the known horrors of their operation pale in comparison. The final chamber contained evidence that the brothers had been testing their compounds on children, using patients' families as unwitting accomplices, in experiments designed to understand how artificial illnesses affected developing minds and bodies. The documentation showed that they had created specific compounds designed to cause temporary developmental delays, behavioral changes, and learning difficulties in young patients. These final revelations were never made public as authorities determined that the information was too disturbing to release and could cause additional trauma to surviving family members. The documents were sealed permanently with access restricted to researchers studying the prevention of medical abuse. Today, the site of the Divine Healing Sanctuary is occupied by a small park dedicated to the memory of the brothers' victims. A simple granite monument lists the names of the 400 confirmed victims along with an inscription that reads, "In memory of those who suffered and died seeking healing and hope. May their tragedy serve as a warning about the dangers of false promises and the importance of questioning those who claim miraculous powers." Margaret Whitmore lived to be 87 years old, spending her final decades working to prevent medical fraud and support victims of deceptive healing practices. Her autobiography, published in 1885, became one of the first detailed accounts of medical fraud investigation and influenced the development of consumer protection laws throughout the United States. Sarah Whitmore, Margaret's daughter, whose artificial illness had first exposed the brothers' operation, became a physician herself, dedicating her career to legitimate medical research and the treatment of patients who had been victims of medical fraud. She established one of America's first clinics specifically designed to help individuals recover from the physical and psychological effects of fraudulent medical treatment. The Hawthorne case fundamentally changed American medicine, leading to the establishment of medical licensing requirements, ethical review boards, and patient protection laws that continue to govern medical practice today. The brothers' crimes demonstrated the need for systematic oversight of medical claims and helped establish the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Hawthorne case is its demonstration of the courage required to challenge respected authority figures when they abuse their positions of trust. Margaret Whitmore's willingness to investigate suspicious circumstances and confront dangerous criminals showed that ordinary citizens have the power to expose the most sophisticated deceptions when they combine determination with careful investigation. The complete story of the Hawthorne brothers' crimes serves as a reminder that evil often disguises itself as virtue. That those who prey on human vulnerability often present themselves as helpers and healers, and that the most dangerous deceptions are those that exploit our deepest needs for hope, healing, and faith. In an age when medical misinformation and fraudulent healing claims continue to exploit vulnerable populations, the Hawthorne case remains a powerful example of why skeptical inquiry and evidence-based evaluation are essential protections against those who would abuse our trust and exploit our desperation. The Hawthorne brothers built their empire of deception on the fundamental human need to believe in miraculous intervention when facing suffering and loss. Their crimes succeeded because they understood that people's desire for hope can override their capacity for skeptical thinking, and that desperation can make even intelligent individuals vulnerable to elaborate deception. But their eventual exposure and punishment also demonstrated that truth has a way of emerging even from the most carefully constructed lies. That evidence-based investigation can overcome even sophisticated deception, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail against even the most calculated evil. The story of the Divine Healing Sanctuary shows us that behind every miracle claim lies either genuine phenomena that can withstand rigorous investigation or carefully constructed deception that crumbles when exposed to determined inquiry. The Hawthorne brothers chose deception, and their choice ultimately led to their destruction and the salvation of countless potential future victims. What do you think about this terrifying tale of medical deception and systematic murder? The Hawthorne brothers' story shows us how easily trust can be exploited and how dangerous false hope can become when it's manufactured by those who profit from human desperation. Have you ever encountered situations where medical or healing claims seem too good to be true? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from our community of truth seekers. If you found this investigation as chilling as I did, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our explorations into America's darkest secrets. Remember, only by understanding these historical horrors can we protect ourselves from similar deceptions today. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and never stop seeking the truth, no matter how disturbing it might be.